Good evening. Thank you all for coming out. Good evening.
Good evening.
All right. Good. Professor and me, like the interaction. I'm Dr. Chambers. I am associate professor in the history department and the director of the African American and African Studies program. Director of AAAS. On behalf of the Department of Religious Studies, Muslim Studies, and AAAS, I welcome you all out. I know it's cold out there and snowy and all of those things, and so we really appreciate it. I also want to thank you for those of you who came out last week to hear the first speaker in the series, Zaire Ali, who talked about Malcolm X. And tonight we have the second speaker who I'll introduce in a second. But I also want to remind you that we still have one more speaker, third speaker in the series, who is Dr. Kayla Wheeler, and she's an assistant professor of African American Studies and Digital Studies at Grand Valley State University. And there are flyers going around, and she will be here on Tuesday, March 26th at 4 p.m. in this room. And so you will continuously hear about this. You'll get emails and all of those things over the next couple of weeks, but we appreciate your support. Okay, and so with that said, I will introduce our speaker, Dr. Eula Taylor. And Dr. Taylor is the class of 1960 chair in undergraduate education. Dr. Eula Taylor is the class of 1960 chair in undergraduate education and professor of African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She is the author of The Veiled Garvey, The Life and Times of Amy Jacques Garvey, co-author of Panther, A Pictorial History of the Black Panther Party and the Story Behind the Film, and co-editor of Black California Dreamin', The Crisis of California African American Communities, and her most recent book, on which the talk will be based in part, The Promise of Patriarchy, Women in the Nation of Islam. Her articles on African American women's history and feminist theory have appeared in the Journal of African American History, Journal of Women's History, Feminist Studies, Souls, and other academic journals and edited volumes. In 2013, she received the Distinguished Professor Teaching Award for the University of California, Berkeley. Only 5% of the academic senate faculty received this honor, and she is the second African American woman in the history of the university to receive this award. Dr. Taylor is most proud, however, of her brilliant graduate students who currently hold postdoctoral fellowships, assistant and associate professorships at various universities throughout the United States. And so it's with this that I welcome Dr. Eula Taylor. Oh, also, here's the book. Right? Go out and get the book.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Oh, okay. Can you hear me better?
Yes.
Oh, you guys rock. Look at all these people here with snow all on the ground. I just assumed it was going to be me. Thank you so very, very much for coming out. I really, really, really appreciate it. I know some of you all are here because your professor assigned it, and you are here because, you kind of like had to pull yourself to come here. I thank you especially for coming, because that means that you truly, truly appreciate what's happening in your classroom, and you appreciate that your professors have put a lot of energy and effort into expanding the learning experience beyond the 2 hours you're in the classroom. So thank you for being here. And I also want to thank all of the sponsors for bringing me here today. And Professor Mohammed, Khalil, I really appreciate all of your energy and effort into negotiating and navigating me to be here today. I have to tell you, my husband said that I took everything but a camel to get here today. Okay. I live in Oakland, California, and we have a small little airport, and so we don't have as many planes leaving compared to San Francisco. So it took me a little bit longer, but I feel so honored and thankful to be here. Today I'm going to talk about this new book, fairly new book that I wrote, The Promise of Patriarchy, and I'm going to talk with a prepared talk and slides for about 35 minutes, and then I'll open it up for conversation, especially since some of you have read the book. And if you haven't, perhaps the conversation that I engage with you today will ignite some questions. So again, thank you for being here, and I'll just go ahead and get started. Why would a woman choose to live within the grips of patriarchy? This is the question that drives the narrative of my recent book, and it gets at the larger assumption posed by anthropologist Saba Mahmood, who argues there is a belief that we all seek to assert our own autonomy when allowed to do so, and that human agency primarily consists of acts that challenge social norms and not those that uphold them. This evening, I want to think through the collective choices of women who joined the Nation of Islam between 1930 and 1975. Their choices run against feminist sensibilities, but they allow us to arrive at another understanding of empowerment for Black women during this period. The realities of race, class, gender, sexuality, and religion in Black women's lives creates an intersectional existence. Legal scholar Kim Crenshaw writes that intersectionality should shift our understanding of patriarchy as the main root of Black women's oppression. It is because of the cross currents of racism and sexism, Crenshaw argues, that Black people live in an environment that creates sex-based norms and expectation that racism operates simultaneously to deny. That is, Black men are not viewed as powerful, and Black women are not seen as passive. The results of these cross-cutting forces have pushed some in the Black liberation struggle to create institutions and to build traditions that are intentionally patriarchal. The Nation of Islam represents one such movement, bent on reversing patterns that collide with racist gendered expectations. Throughout the nation's history, women labored to debunk every stereotype that haunted Black womanhood. They remade themselves into Muslim women by prioritizing modesty, marriage, and motherhood. All three of these goals are in line with traditional thinking that places women on the periphery of masculine power. Nation women traded any desire for fuller self-determination for their Muslim faith. In fact, their faith became a blueprint on how best to disrupt and dismantle harmful racial stereotypes in order to secure honor and protection. I want to focus on modesty today because Nation women exhibited restraint, and they were an antithesis to the alleged bodacious and hypersexualized Black woman. They remade themselves into bold outward expressions, and their religious devotion was evident to all as they stood proud and looked regal in their uniforms. Their markers of piety evidence an interior virtuousness. Modesty and humility were central to their inner selves, as well as their outer self-presentation. Many of the feminine virtues that Nation women adopted can be read, however, as disempowering, such as avoiding the gaze of men, and the development of feminine shyness in order to secure a husband. Yet we cannot dismiss their own interpretation of their deportment. They saw themselves as being respectful to men in their lives, men who were not respected by the larger culture. Moreover, Nation women created their Islamic modesty as in opposition to what they saw as a problem with the secular world. They said they were embracing their natural beauty. Wanting to be seen as lovely too often translated into Black women wearing unflattering wigs at this time, and they pointed this out. They also pointed out the ill-fitting clothes and the uncomfortable shoes that Black women were wearing. And they pointed out that this was unnatural. But as we know, playing by the rules of the beauty culture has its rewards. Years after divorcing his first wife, legendary boxer Muhammad Ali could still remember what Sanjay Roy was wearing at their first meeting. He told her, quote, "You had on a pair of tight blue jeans and a red striped long sleeve sweater jacket. And when you got up, I noticed you had a beautiful little shape with a slight twist in your hips. And when you walked past me, I was more convinced that I was going to marry you." As a woman who had won beauty contests, modeled, and worked in bunny clubs, Sanjay had grown accustomed to roaming eyes upon her. The same physicality and sensuality that had opened doors of opportunity for her had also captured Muhammad Ali's attention. After marriage to Ali, Sanjay confronted the mandate that an Islamic woman's beauty must be reserved exclusively for her husband. Unlike other women who joined the nation, Sanjay refused to let go of her beauty practice, which relied on lipstick, false eyelashes, mini skirts, and form-fitting knit dresses. Her investment in American beauty culture kept her at odds with the nation's standards for women, and she ultimately left the movement. But if wearing what she liked gave Sanjay back an identity that she found pleasing, one must still ask the question, how much more freedom does she or any other woman have when it comes to submitting to standards of femininity? Whether it's the beauty industry or the nation rules, one can argue that in both cases, the epitome of feminization is to be a submissive follower to someone or something. Submission was required for all nation women, not only to a supreme being, Allah, but to the males such as the ministers, fathers, and husbands in their lives. Marital harmony demanded the obligation of women to fulfill the needs of their husbands. But what did nation women want when they agreed to submit to their husbands? Can we find agency in their submission? Nation women, Nation women noted their attraction to a family model where their husbands were the providers and the protectors. Here we see Sister Clara Mohammed and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. They and their members envisioned a marriage with the choice of not working outside the home. Yet they were not alone in this regard. For a good portion of Black women, mental health is linked to wealth, and balance is an outgrowth of financial security. Not worrying about the payment of monthly bills brings peace of mind, which opens up avenues for self-expression. Yet financial freedom has always proved difficult to achieve for single Black women. Seeking relief from their own vulnerability, heterosexual Black women have leaned toward marriage for both emotional and financial security. In fact, contemporary Black women are more likely than white women to report a preference for males having a primary financial responsibility, despite the remoteness of such a prospect in the 21st century. When nation membership was at its height during the early 1960s, probably no more than 15,000, marriage was still fundamental to African American life. In 1960, 64.9% of Black women between the ages of 25 and 44 were living with a husband. Only 10% of Black women from the same age group in 1960 had never been married. By 1970, this number decreased slightly to 62%, before dropping to only 44% in 1980. Although marriage rates among African American women declined drastically beginning in the 1980s, nation women were no different from their Black sisters in their desire to be married. The wish for a husband, however, cannot be exclusively reduced to the longing for a breadwinner. Jamesetta X, known in the music world as Etta James, became a member of the Nation of Islam in the early 1960s. She wrote that her conversion was clinched when she saw, quote, those fine-looking, clean-cut Muslim brothers. For years, she had been drawn to men that made her feel safe, and Black men in the nation represented the epitome of protectors. Nevertheless, the Black marriage pool has, to a great degree, relied on the assumption of employment. Economic shifts in the high rate of Black male incarceration and premature death have transformed the possibilities of a financially stable head of household. Thus, recent lower rates of Black marriage do not simply reflect a loss of interest on the part of Black men and women. The preference for for a financial breadwinner has remained consistent among many Black heterosexual women. Even the possibility, the relinquishing of financial power to one's husband might lead into domination has not diminished Black women's fondness for male family heads. Moreover, all of the possible harmful elements of an institution so deeply embedded in reinforcing inequality, gender roles, gender hierarchy, and male power have not diminished patriarchal marriage as a coveted choice for many women. Now, one can argue that there is a difference between desiring economic support and consciously agreeing to be submissive. But there is another factor in women's decision to follow the teaching of the Nation of Islam. Family structure in African American life has a complicated history, and many scholars discuss the impact of slavery on that structure. The Nation's teachings were in conversation with this literature. Nation women ultimately wanted to make men greatly responsible to them and their families, giving them a sense of security in a violently racist environment. For them, a masculine and feminine arrangement of the world mattered because it dictated that nation men become responsible to their families. This is an important distinction. Nation women agreed to submit to their husbands in the context of the nation's teachings that a man should not marry if he was unable to support his family. The logic on this point mirrors contemporary studies that indicate when men don't work or don't earn adequate wages, they do not perceive themselves as marriageable, nor do women perceive them as men to marry. Unlike Christian evangelicals who advance that it's within a benignly patriarchal family that males become men because they are motivated to be responsible, the Nation of Islam teachings advance that only responsible men should marry. In fact, an irresponsible man proved unworthy for a Nation of Islam woman. After marriage, Nation men were faced with even more pressure to provide and to protect, with the ultimate goal of a healthy masculinity. Healthy masculinity and the Nation of Islam's mandate that patriarchal authority be balanced with love, respect, and protection are interchangeable principles, yet they are very hard to calculate. It is much easier for scholars to dig in pessimism, to showcase the unloved woman or the disrespected wife as a way to analyze gender domination. But the lived experiences of African American women in general and Nation women in particular demand us to do so much more. The establishment of healthy families has been the utmost concern of most Black women, and this is why some of them broke the rules of patriarchy in order to support it. In other words, they learned to trump patriarchy. And I have to share, I coined this term before the election of the 45th president. Whether it meant shielding her husband from direct confrontation about not fully providing for the family, or taking control to ensure family stability, trumping patriarchy was a choice a woman might need depending upon whom she married and how he earned a living. When Belinda, the second wife of Muhammad Ali, stands as a powerful example of a woman who successfully trumped patriarchy. They married in 1967, only a few months before Ali was stripped of his boxing license and heavyweight championship after refusing to be inducted into the army. In the privacy of their home, Belinda was faced with a husband unsure about his professional future and ability to provide for his family. She recalled that, quote, "It was tough for him. He was depressed most of the time. He was unhappy. He didn't know what the hell was going to happen to him." How does a wife talk to a temperamental husband when in theory he wields all the power? Trumping patriarchy meant using one's own ingenuity to manipulate social relations, steeped in structured power. As Belinda explained, manipulation is not always bad. It's a form of devotion, a form of power to help and inspire and give a man drive. Essentially, trumping patriarchy disrupted the manpower landscape to ensure enough authority for short-term leadership. Belinda is the one that initiated the campaign to make Ali the people's champ. As Ali worried about going to jail, Belinda had faith that the boxing industry could not resist making money off of him. Belinda became Ali's unofficial publicist and circulated stickers and buttons with his photos on it. She also worked as a campaign manager. She got the attention of sports journalists like Howard Cosell on her husband's behalf. In the meantime, Belinda also knew that her husband needed an income, so she encouraged Ali to seize opportunities to speak at college campuses for an honorarium. Ali's early speeches were described as boring, simply because he constantly just repeated, Elijah Muhammad dictates what we want and what we believed. And people would complain. He complained to Belinda that he was also being called a draft dodger. In response, Belinda offered to write the speeches, and soon Ali was noted for giving fantastic lectures that earned between $1,500 and $2,000 each. When they were in public, however, Belinda never spoke. Certainly, Belinda was able to accommodate to this public performance because of her domestic power and her ability to trump patriarchy in the obliging spirit of maintaining her family. Husband management became a lifestyle for Belinda during the early years of their marriage. She walked a tightrope, taking control for fleeting periods as both a form of self-preservation and in the service to safeguard patriarchy. In the nation, we see women engage in a range of bargaining within patriarchal relationships. Respectful disagreement happened, but wives tended to yield to their husbands. The ideal of yielding can be seen as a sleight of hand, a concept meant only to conceal or mystify simple obedience. Because yielding as a strategy fails to resemble a sledgehammer attack against patriarchy, it is missed as a possible form of agency. For example, Belinda counted on Ali Belinda counted on Ali to see that additional women would be harmful to their marriage. And she also counted that this insight would push him to relinquish the idea. She was not wrong. Tragically, however, for Belinda and her 4 children, Ali's understanding came too late. Years later, he did admit that his behavior had been shameful. It hurt my wife, it offended God, he said. In the meantime, Belinda was not obliged to wait for Ali to come to grips with his own immorality. So now we're going to see a little clip of her immediately after.
In your past, Mr. Chair, what was the first
Can you hear?
love, marriage, or money?
Well, he didn't have any money when I had it. There was no money to be found. No, exile. You know, this was during the time he was exiled, no money, no credit cards, no boxing. So I got him on a downstroke.
So you
He
lived
was
in
like, of course. Yeah, that's what you're supposed to do with our Laotian brothers when they're down and out, you pick them up. You know? It's no use of picking them up when they're already up. So he was on his downstroke. He didn't have anything to do but get married and raise a family. This is the best point of his life. Otherwise, he would have had the time. You remember this, John? You remember this? This is the legend of Cassius Clay, the most beautiful fighter in the world today. This kid's fights great. He got speed in the business. We try to fight him. Increase your insurance. This kid's got a left. This kid's got a right. Look at the kid carrying like, oh, the college kid is fighting. There's not enough room. They only lower the boom. Who would have thought when they came to the fight that they would see a space satellite? Oh, who's that?
May I say that? Now, see, Ali, you've been fooling a lot of us like you've been writing poetry. Now we know the real deal.
Okay. When her strategy of yielding did not work as she had hoped, she did not obey. She ended her marriage by filing for divorce in 1976, charging Ali with desertion, adultery, and mental cruelty. The nation did not frown on divorce. Elijah Muhammad's teachings were novel in this regard. Women understanding that they could opt out of a difficult marriage gave them more room to reinvent their lives in the nation. Having children could complicate the decision to divorce, and unbalanced power relations can oppress women and injure their identities. Certainly, there is a fine line between service to one's spouse and abuse, and many women in the Nation of Islam walk this tightrope daily. Sister Zanti, for example, said that, quote, men didn't only want control, they got it, and by force if necessary. Tragically, she knew brothers who beat their wives. wounded in homes where love and peace should have resided, Zanti and other nation women experienced harm and humiliation due to their subordinated status. Nation women who suffered abuse because they took the risk of accepting patriarchal authority and yielding and bargaining in their marriages should not, however, be blamed for their own oppression. Instead, we need to understand the choices they made within the context of the options available to them. It is more useful for feminists to treat both domination and freedom as structural concepts that highlight the positions of the individual in the world. Black women's position in the world has led to so many frustrations. Historically and in the current moment, African American women too often occupy the lowest rung of the capitalist ladder, at great distance from structural power, which directly informs their freedom to act. Largely confined to the working class, many women who join the nation have few alternatives for self-support. In fact, many of them would have worked as domestics, which would not have guaranteed even more of a fair treatment than in a patriarchal marriage. The burden of poverty is complicated by the assumptions that their survival tactics emasculate Black men. This is why some Black women, for instance, those in the Nation of Islam, wish to achieve a place where they were not working outside the home and not being blamed for hurting Black men. Other Black women uttered during the same time period that having to make a man feel like a man makes them uncertain about marriage. Even within the nation, a woman's financial position impacted how she might be able to navigate patriarchal structures. For example, some women wanted to attend college, but were told that they could not go to school at night. Women requested exceptions, stating they needed only one class and that it was offered at night. But the Honorable Elijah Muhammad refused to grant any exceptions based on the rhetoric of protection. Yet legendary poet and activist Sister Sonia Fivex Sanchez, who joined the Nation of Islam in 1972 and worked as a professor at Amherst College, had the funds to pay for a male escort in order to work in the evening. This separated her from other working-class nation women. Clearly, nation women experienced patriarchy unevenly and in unpredictable ways. But when they could negotiate or manipulate, they did. No doubt Sanchez, who was a regular writer for Muhammad Speaks and dedicated her 1974 book, A Blues Book for Blue Black Magical Women, to her spiritual father, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, Messenger of Allah, who has labored 42 years to deliver us from this Western Babylon, used her access to power for her benefit. She was not alone in this regard. For instance, Sister Gwendolyn 2X Simmons used her brother-in-law's position as a highly placed official in Chicago to cushion her from the dictates of the sister captain and the mosque minister. Time and time again, Gwendolyn usurped power and lived according to her own rules. Prior to her nation membership, she had never yielded nor engaged in patriarchal bargaining. As a nation woman, she was excited about building a Black community and continued to work with the National Council of Negro Women as a field representative. Unwilling to separate her work outside the home from building a Black nation, she found ways to evade the direct supervision of her husband, mosque minister, and sister captain. What set her apart from other nation women was her access to different kinds of structural power. Sister Gwendolyn's story reveals that the structures of class, race, gender, and sexuality that impact Black folks' lives were interactive and cannot be isolated as influences. One cannot fight exclusively in one direction. Moreover, her willingness to battle in multiple movements echoes that of other Black women, such as Sojourner Truth, who is essential to feminist critiques of patriarchy. Are you guys okay? Are you hearing this? Okay. If I were at home in California, I would think that an earthquake was about to happen, but I know that's not happening here. Okay. The deep structural inequalities in the United States is political and anchored in discrimination. Black women's subordination exists along multiple registers and is therefore greater than the sum of racism and sexism. Yet it is because of racism and sexism that discussions of welfare policy in the United States changed policy and established a view of Black family life as pathological and deviant. Scholars, activists, and Black religious leaders used it as a means to argue for or against patriarchy. Essentially, this heated discussion gave the nation more ammunition for its masculine teachings and mantra to do for self. Elijah Muhammad taught the members of his Black nations that they should not be a financial burden on anyone. If there was no job, he declared, create your own, because no one likes a beggar. Despite the nation's extreme criticism of those who accepted charity, Mr. Muhammad's most destitute mothers brought groceries with food stamps, used Medicaid at doctors' offices, and sometimes kept a roof over the family head with a housing voucher issued by the state. Sister Doris 9X was a prime example of a believer who lived with her husband, a nation member, yet had to accept welfare. Her decision to do so, to do what she had to do, comes through in a statement she wrote after she was convicted of welfare fraud. All I could think about was the deep, piercing pains of the Muslim brothers proclaiming they would protect the Black women and then not doing it. I was paying the price for being my own protector and guide. Sister Marie X, a mother of 12, shared Sister Doris 9X's desperation to keep her children clothed and fed. Also accepting welfare because her husband, who was a nation member, left the house every time she got pregnant. Sister Maria X said out of frustration, "These children don't belong to the mosque or the welfare department. My husband should be found and thrown into jail for the rest of his life." One of the major contradictions of the nation is that its success was predicated on establishing a separate existence and presenting Islam as a materially empowering religion, even though too many of its members were barely making ends meet. Their lack of wealth was in stark contrast to Elijah Muhammad and his royal family. By the early 1970s, the royal family had built 5 mansions and for their personal use, costing close to $2 million. The nation was no longer a dinky Islamic storefront. By the 1970s, it was noted as one of the richest Black organizations in American history. As the royal family basked in the nation's wealth, the women's movement hit full force. By the 1970s, the women's movement ideas stood in direct contrast to the image of the happy housewife of the 1950s. And it presented an ongoing challenge to the Nation of Islam teachings. As the nation used its Islamic identity to defend modesty, marriage, and motherhood as a natural state for women, feminist activists argued that it was in the home that women were reduced to a subservient other, an other that was tragically oppressed. To avoid the feeling of entrapment, the liberal women's movement gave the suburban housewife a language to articulate her frustrations and anger, which they argued were connected to gendered assumptions. Even mainstream advertisers chimed in and developed campaigns by the mid-1970s that added new appeals to old standbys about women as sex objects and the glories of housework. They sought to capitalize upon the frustration. "You deserve a break today" became the well-loved jingle of McDonald's restaurant. It served to appeal to the housewife feeling hurried and unappreciated. As the movement flourished, small cadres of radical feminists offered provocative insights that critique class and race, as well as the family, marriage, love, and normative heterosexuality. Yet Elijah Muhammad made no distinction within the women's movement and lumped all feminists, liberal, radical, lesbian, socialist, cultural, and conservative, together as white women who would guide Black women to commit evil and indecency. Highly offended by the popular fashions, Mr. Muhammad told Black women who experimented with new hairstyles and clothing that they looked like wild game in the jungle. He also said that those who would reply that this is a style, that they were the only thing they were strutting was their ignorance, because they were lost to the knowledge of self and think that whatever white people do, they should follow them. As the liberation movement galvanized young people to protest, nation leaders used its weekly newspaper, Muhammad Speak, to strike a blow against what it perceived as indecency. Every week during the 1970s, women's liberation was critiqued through cartoons, and Black women outside of the Nation of Islam were pictured as a carbon copy of white women gone wrong. Scantily clad women enticed Black men into sexual liaisons. These same women also taught their daughters the art of the tempting death wink. The depiction of black and white women wearing hip-hugging mini dresses and plunging necklines, holding the hand of a girl dressed similarly, was framed by the headline, "The Filth That Produces Filth." Black women were also warned to avoid what the nation leaders described as the abandonment of families by women in the liberation movement. Sister Dorothy Wadad authored a 4-part series in Muhammad Speaks, The Black Woman, in which she taught that black women who followed behind the devil woman, for example, the liberated woman, frowns on the idea of women as homemaker, mother, and wife. She said, "These are the most noble, rightful, and beautiful roles for women who were created for different purposes than men. As mother of civilization and queen of the universe, black women were blessed to reproduce human life. But it was the white man's trigonology to steer black women's minds from motherhood that had created this crisis." She proclaimed, "How better to destroy a nation than to destroy the very means by which it reproduces itself." Women's liberation was nothing short of the devil pushing black families into genocide. The nation took up the theme of genocide in its response to the Supreme Court's 1973 Roe v. Wade. The court affirmed a woman's private right to terminate a pregnancy in the safety of a hospital with a physician, freeing women from the risk associated with an illegal procedure. Outraged, the nation initiated a full-fledged attack against what they described as mass abortions performed on black women by a wicked government. Sister Dorothy charged that while under the knife, many black women were sterilized without even knowing it. Unwanted sterilization was a real issue for poor black women, which gave the nation factual ammunition for its critique. Yet this harmful truth was not enough to stop black women from exercising their right to an abortion. Unable to stop the execution of choice, the nation played the knowledge of self card, claiming that only a black woman who had internalized self-hate would abort a fetus. Clearly, the nation's teachings were directly threatened by the women's movement. Nation leaders were outraged by the idea that women should be liberated from having children when the very laws of creation, they said, it was for their purpose. Nation wives were told to submit to their husbands to make life better for themselves and their children. So what does it mean when a nation woman, as well as an ordinary heterosexual black woman, feel the sense of empowerment resides in a patriarchal structure? The nation gave its believers a concrete vision for a prosperous life, and this is very important. It's important because of its absoluteness in light of uncertainty. In light of uncertainty that frames perceptions and behaviors that make it difficult for black women to live their lives in ways that they desire. Nation women were promised heaven on earth in the form of financial security, of a financially secure family. They were only uncertain about exactly when it would manifest for them. Self-confidence, self-love, and entitlement to earthly riches gave believers what America had failed to offer. Outside of the nation, African American women have been entitled only to the worst jobs, the poorest schools, absolutely no protection from violence, and an assault on their beauty. How black women lived under and handled this siege is one core theme of my book. Certainly, nation women's choices were riddled with contradictions. My contention, however, is that it's at the intersection of their impulses. It reveals their deepest disappointments, their desperations, and their desires. In fact, it is here that the heartbeat of black women working hard and doing more to simply survive America is exposed. Nation women remade themselves to belong to a religion that represented itself as the opposite of a racist United States. Their religious practices were framed by Elijah Muhammad's determination to build a black nation, if only in the mind. Love of self was intrinsic to its formation, along with living a virtuous life, one filled with a courageous spirit to be responsible for the well-being of kinfolk. For more than 40 years, Muhammad's believers fought against the cold calculations of the beast, as he put it, to ensure stable black families. For that greater goal, nation women chose to work within a patriarchal structure, yielding where they could, resisting where they had to. Their primary challenge was to the racist norms that determined their lives. Nation women fought against being labeled backward and uncivilized by promoting a religious lifestyle that was central to their identity. They loved the Nation of Islam, despite its shortcomings. It offered them hope, stability, protection, and freedom on their own terms. It also gave them a picture of patriarchy that at times reflected the seductive landscape of white privilege. It is in my most sincere hope that women who fall outside of its recorded history, women who gave so much with the purest intention to build a Black nation, with love and possibility, see a glimmer of themselves in my work. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for staying awake. Appreciate it. So I just open it up for questions. So I'm now going to open it up for questions or comments.
I don't have a question, just use a microphone if anybody needs it.
Hello, it was a great talk. Thank you for all your research and work. I haven't read the book, so sorry about that.
Oh,
And I'm
you
not.
know what? But you still can.
I absolutely. I'm not a student here currently.
Okay.
But the question is, how do you define this Nation of Islam? What does the term nation mean in this context?
Yes. The Nation of Islam, it began as the Allah Temple of Islam in the 1930s in Detroit.
Okay.
And so it was part and parcel of a moment in the 1930s when there were all of these religious offerings to try to adjust to the economic upheaval. This is when the Jehovah's Witnesses come into being. So during the 1930s, there are a lot of religious offerings to try to negotiate and understand and make sense of the Great Depression. And the Allah Temple of Islam was one of those offerings that came into existence in 1930. And by 1934, it begins to morph a little bit because we see some of the leadership going to Chicago. And by World War II, we see a transition from the Allah Temple of Islam into the Nation of Islam, wherein Black people in the U.S. are coming together in hopes of building, quote, quote, a Black nation. A Black nation that's grounded in a particular Islamic offering.
1930 was the start.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Mm-hmm. All right, so I've read part of the book so far. And I was just curious as to if you could speak a little bit to how the beauty standards of the Nation of Islam impacted the women within the movement.
Oh, the beauty standards are so, so very, very important because, once again, a whole lot of contradictions. On the one hand, the Nation of Islam pushed something called natural beauty. That is, they discouraged wearing makeup and lipstick. They also discouraged wearing your hair straightened. But they did say that if you needed to use a warm comb occasionally, you should do so. Okay. Okay. We also know that even though they discouraged women from wearing makeup, some women had no problem actually selling what today we would call Avon or Mary Kay to other women. So on the one hand, a lot of it was grounded in a notion that the beauty of Black women had always been under siege in America. That is, Black women were never going to be, quote, quote, beautiful when compared to a European standard of, quote, quote, beauty. And so Black women's fight to get there oftentimes pushed them outside of what they should look like. And so they would constantly critique that. And so this is why they talked about something called a natural beauty. The naturalness also came from a really healthy diet. One of the big critiques of the Nation of Islam was that most of the illness was because of obesity. People not living, not eating correctly. And so a lot of the physical ills were related to one's temple being out of sync. So if you were eating largely a vegetarian diet during the 1930s when there were a few options for that to happen, right? you would actually feel better and look better. You can even think about and drink a lot of water in your own life. You drink a lot of water, have a vegetarian diet, your skin tends to look a little bit different, right, than if you have spent a lot of time at a fast food. So in many ways, that also came, the beauty was also related to having a clean temple.
And thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, thinking about 70s, how was the perception of black Muslim women in this movement related to, for example, other political sectors that in that time within the black community were in the search, for example, the black female militants. I was thinking, for example, somebody like Angela Davis, how would be she considered from the perception of black Muslim women? How were the contrast, how were the connections or disconnections between what the perception of how was as a society, the community with what activism like the one that Angela Davis was coming could offer to the black community?
Sure. In many ways, your question is important because it gets at how the Nation of Islam changed over time. So those women who were in the nation in the 1930s are going to have a very different experience from those who were there in the 40s versus the 50s versus those who come in the post-1965 period. So when we look at people like Sister Sonia Sanchez or Sister Gwendolyn Simmons, they come into the Nation of Islam after having been in, hey, I haven't seen you in a while, okay? After having been in political organizations, whether it's SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the Black Arts Movement. So they bring those experiences into the Nation of Islam. But for some of them, it's a challenge and they don't stay very long. So for example, when we go back to the beauty standards, by 1970, Elijah Muhammad is very, very critical of what he describes as men wearing quote-unquote feminine attire. So for example, at this time, dashikis are very popular, people are wearing afros, and he said, don't come into the mosque looking like that. He basically told all the men, do not have a beard. A beard, going back to beauty standards, we never talk about them in terms of men, but he said men should not wear beards. He said beards are nothing but germ catchers. He said, as everyone touches their beard, right? He said beards are germ catchers, right? He said you should not have, large afros because that's a feminine hair. You shouldn't wear platform shoes. That's a feminine attire. And so for some women who are coming in there wearing dashikis, he's saying the same thing. It's inappropriate. And so what we see, if you stay in the Nation of Islam long enough, you're going to have to adjust accordingly. For some people, that adjustment was small given the larger result of a nation-building project. The fact that the Nation of Islam had its own schools, had its own grocery stores, had its own laundries. So basically, it was a nation within the nation, and they understood being part of the modern civil rights movement that this Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act was not going to change the mindset of people who want to oppress you. Sure.
I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit of why there was the contradiction of beauty standards and why, it was okay to occasionally use a hot comb or use, like certain face products and,
Well, I think that it gets to the whole idea that, like most, it's hard to be in the sea of America and not get wet by it. We can have all of our most purest and true intentions, but the fact of the matter is hard not to get wet by it, right? And so, on the one hand, the rhetoric was to tell Black people, you're beautiful just the way you are. You don't have to do anything else. So don't listen to all of the narrative that you need to look unlike yourself to be beautiful. So this is why a lot of the literature in the newspaper called Black women queens of the universe, right? Of civilization, and you should be put on a pedestal as opposed to being up underneath it. At the same time, people are individual. They have their own human desire and their own human wants. And so I think in many ways that gets to people adjusting as far as they could, but not adjusting as far as they could, but understanding that they were living in their own individual body.
So I'm a social work major, and one of the big things is competency. What would you consider most important for a non-nation member to be competent about?
For a non-nation member.
Well, not member, sorry.
Okay.
Member of society.
Oh, okay. Competent about what?
Just sort of like the culture aspect of it.
I'm not understanding your question.
Just like if there would be anything to take into account that may be deviant from the rest of America at the time, I suppose.
Oh, so are you asking what is it about the Nation of Islam that could be perceived as radical compared to the heteronormative? Oh, that they were critiquing racism. And this is why, in fact, they despite all of the conservative way of understanding, gender-specific role playing, the fact that they are critiquing racism and calling it what it is why it's perceived as radical. In fact, it's because they were critiquing racism that those in authority saw them as radical. Because actually, they were not. Okay. They're not. But because they're critiquing racism at every turn, authorities begin to see and watch them. This is why there's at no point in the Nation of Islam, the Allah Temple of Islam, and the Nation of Islam history, that the FBI or the local police is not watching them. Because they are critiquing racism. I hope that answers your question. Yeah,
you said something at the beginning of your presentation that's been bothering me since because I just missed it. And you said it was
that's
like,
why it's bothering you.
Yeah.
You didn't get it all.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay.
you said it was like 3 ideals or
Marriage, modesty, and motherhood. Is that those 3?
Yeah, and you said those are what Islamic women were expected to live by.
Yes.
Marriage, modesty, and what?
Motherhood.
Mother. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. That was easy.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit. I haven't read your book yet.
That's
but,
okay.
I was just wondering if you could talk about a little bit within the contemporary moment that we're in, maybe some of the pushback that we see within the patriarchal structure of the Nation of Islam.
Sure. Well, I think it's important to say that the Nation of Islam that exists in 2019 is not the Nation of Islam that I researched. So my research is dealing with the time period from 1930 to 1975, which today many people talk about as the original Nation of Islam under the leadership of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. When he died, his nation died. And when he died, his nation died, and his son was given the lead. Many people didn't like the way the son was leading the Nation of Islam towards a more quote-unquote orthodox understanding of Islam, and we begin to see a lot of splinter groups. And I think at the tail end, when I finished my book, I think I counted like 24 splinter groups, with Farrakhan being the leader of the one that has the largest number. But there are a lot of splinter groups that basically say that they've taken on the mantle and leading in the direction of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. So it's really, really hard to say that there is one Nation of Islam, given the fact that there are all of these different splinter groups, and some of these splinter groups have tension with each other in terms of saying who actually is in the best position to lead. I'm going to go back here. Sorry, I'm kind of going like this, okay? All right. Hello. Hi.
So, I guess I don't know where to start. This is a very interesting topic for me. I've been in the nation for 20 years under the leadership of the Honorable Minister Farrakhan. So this is different. This is a different kind of environment for me. I say 20 years because I'm 20 years old.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Black on crack. I'm not that old. So when we talk about splinter groups, just to, I guess, shed some light on that. The way I've been taught is that the nation never died. It built afterwards by the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan. There is a lot of tension around that for various reasons, and that's another book, a whole nother book to research. But I just wanted
That you should write.
maybe. But yeah, I just wanted to go back to a few points that you mentioned from, I guess, now to give some perspective to 2019 Nation of Islam and how it's changed over time, if that's okay. And so this idea of modesty, marriage, and motherhood is still important. However, I think there's a bigger space between, I guess, modesty, marriage, and motherhood as far as what's important and what's priority. And growing up, my father was a minister in the Nation of Islam, and with many of, I guess you could say, the stereotypes of patriarchy in the nation, I guess he goes against all of that because it was never pushed on me or any of my sisters, not even my brothers, that marriage is a priority. Education is priority. How we treat ourselves is priority. Learning how to take care of ourselves on our own is priority. And because you won't be able to maintain a marriage if you don't know yourself, you won't be able to be a mother if you don't know yourself. And so these things have also changed. The representation of women in Islam is definitely, I guess you could say, different. We have a lot more women leaders than there once were, and a lot more people on the forefront, and I guess you could say radical ways. Minister Ava Muhammad being one very strong example that I guess you could say goes unnoticed if there isn't, people actually interested in learning about it. The idea of submission is definitely something because today it is not the same. It's more submission to Allah, and you should not submit to another being because they aren't God, essentially, and that gets into that idea of polytheism. I don't want to rant, and I don't want to be that girl, but this is a very, yeah. So, and there's also different, I guess, rhetoric around certain topics now coming from Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan that can sometimes be controversial, but I think it's always healthy to interrogate what you learn and hit it from all sides and make sure that you're constantly in a state of researching and learning. I'm constantly in a state of researching, learning, and questioning. So I guess that's my sorry for the length of
No, it's okay. You point out an important point in terms of under Elijah Muhammad, there were no women ministers. That is a big difference between the leadership under the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Farrakhan because there were no women. The highest woman was the sister captain in the mosque, and now that there are women ministers. I think also, and that's a huge difference. Another huge difference I would say is how Africa is understood as a continent. Because one of the things when you look in Muhammad Speaks, I'm going to walk on up because I was were you guys okay? No, okay, I'm walking up. One of the things, if you look at Muhammad Speaks during this time period from up until 1975, you see a very interesting engagement with the continent of Africa. Particularly once we begin to, in the post-1965 period, we have a lot of organizing around Africa because of the liberation movements there and the kind of connections. And under Elijah Muhammad, he basically did not see Africa as home. He basically encouraged Black people in the U.S. to understand that home was where we are and how we make it here. And so it wasn't a reference point. Africa was not a reference point for this Black nation. It makes it kind of interesting because you have a Black nationalist organization and movement that's not referencing Africa in a way that we see these other traditional Black nationalist organizations doing, particularly something like Garveyites, for example. And that was my first book, was on Marcus Garvey's second wife. Okay. Oh, okay.
A little bit about Clara Mohammed and her I don't even
Okay. You don't want the mic.
Can you talk about Clara Mohammed?
Sure. Oh, yes, sure. Clara Mohammed is so very, very interesting because she had so much, she carried so much weight in the nation because she was there at the very go to these meetings, right? And she came home and said, you know, he asked about you. And so in many ways, the early years from like 1930 up until 1934, she is really, really pushing and encouraging her husband to be part and parcel of the Ala Temple of Islam because she understood how it could benefit her family. Her family was struggling at the time, and her husband was struggling with his own desperation during the Great Depression. He was drinking, he couldn't hold a job. And so she was also trying to figure out how can we make this work. And the Ala Temple of Islam, she saw, had answers for them. So she's very, very important for that early moment. She's also important because of her own formal schooling. So Clara Mohammed went to school longer than her husband. She had more formal education than her husband. It's clear that she helped to write things for him, that she would read newspapers out loud for him. And so they were very, very close in that regard. When Elijah Muhammad and about 100 other men were incarcerated because of their refusal to go to World War II, people often talk about the role of Clara Mohammed. That is, she would be able to go and visit her husband and come back with a message to share amongst the converts. And so in that regard, she was very important for those early years. But she also becomes a physical symbol for a virtuous nation woman for several reasons. One, she continued to maintain a very slim body her entire adult life. And so she never, at the 120 pounds was the weight that women were expected to weigh and no more. And she physically never looks like she weighed more than that. So she always held herself with a level of dignity and pride, even amidst rumors circulating about her husband having additional wives and her behind the scenes, her having to negotiate all of that. So because she wrote very little, I think I was only able to find one, maybe two pieces in Muhammad Speaks that were attributed to her. She wrote very little. In many ways, I read her archive through her pictures because I could look at the pictures that were taken of her in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, and I tried to use those images to write a narrative, or pictures where she's sitting next to a younger woman who eventually is going to be a wife of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and to try to read what that life might have been like through a pictorial representation. But she's very, very complicated, and I think complicated largely because she didn't leave her own written words. And so therefore, we're kind of forced to fill in the blanks in ways that can be troubling if we're not careful. And I think that's why, even though a lot of people put up Sister Clara Mohammed in a particular kind of way, largely because of the Sister Clara Mohammed schools, right, that come into existence in 75, I really put a lot of energy and effort into trying to locate other women that had an archive that I thought were very interesting and who could provide a little bit more detail on the inner workings of the organization. But a lot of people to this day, they constantly go towards Sister Clara Mohammed. And it's very interesting because they have so little to work with in terms of the archive, a written archive.
I know a lot of prominent members of the Nation of Islam eventually rejected the nation, transitioned into Sunni Islam, right? They found it more inclusive, at least racially. Did anything similar happen to the women of Nation of Islam?
You mean, so women,
I'm thinking of Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali.
Oh, you mean, well, sure, yes, we do have women who also go into quote, more, quote, traditional Orthodox Islam. But I think it's important to say that men always converted at a higher rate than women. So because of patriarchy, because of masculinity, the conversion rate tended to be like 7 to 1. So there were always more men in the nation than women. And this is why a woman in the nation could actually expect to meet and marry a man who could financially support them.
interesting presentation. I wonder if you might say a word about what drew you to this project.
Sure, absolutely. I was drawn to this project because of Spike Lee's movie Malcolm X. And I write about this in the introduction, and I think it came out, was it in 95? 92? 92. I had just earned my PhD. It was 1992, I had just earned my PhD, and I had been an assistant professor for about 4 months. And I was asked to be on a panel for the movie. Not because I knew anything about the Nation of Islam, not because I knew anything about Malcolm X. I was asked because they didn't have a woman. They had these 2 men to be on the panel, and they were looking for a woman to participate, so they asked me. Yes, they were. So I guess like at the last minute they were looking, it was like 4 men. They were looking like, oh, this may not be the best thing. Maybe we can see if we can get a woman. And so they called me at the last minute, and initially I said no. Why like last minute? You know, I mean, I know I'm not famous. I've only been here like 4 months, but still last minute. And one of my colleagues said, no, you should do it. So I did it because my colleague asked me to do it. And so at that time, I knew that if there were any questions in that movie about a woman, the questions were, everyone was going to look at me on the panel. So I ran to the library to try to learn as much as I could about women in the Nation of Islam, and I was shocked by the lack of scholarly work. I was absolutely shocked because there were loads of books on Malcolm X, there were loads of books on the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, there were loads of books on Muhammad Ali, and there were a lot of memoirs, largely written by men, talking about their experience in the Nation of Islam. And when it came to women, what I found very interesting, going back to your question about beauty, were like, for example, a pictorial spread in Essence magazine of women, you know, in beautiful garb. They had not been engaged with as a scholarly subject. And I was just really floored by that. And so I went to the movie. Of course, I was so over concerned. No one asked me anything. No one was thinking about the few women in that movie at all. So all of that pressure or not. But what it did was it opened a void, a historical void for me that I continued to think about even though I was doing other projects. And so I began to read Muhammad Speaks voraciously. I mean, I was just reading and reading and reading and reading. And then I wrote a small article. I kind of thought I was done. And then by this time, people began to write dissertations. And so you see dissertations on Sister Clara Mohammed. You see dissertations on women in the Nation of Islam, largely 1960 and forward. So then I was like, oh, more and more people are engaging in this, let me read it. But I was still not as excited about the work. I kind of felt, I only learned a little bit. I shouldn't say that, especially they were great. Okay. It was great work. But I was, I kind of felt like there more work could be done. And so at that time, I went to Detroit. And I said, I'm going to go to Detroit one more time just to see what they have. And I went to Detroit, and while I was there, I located a pamphlet that I had never seen quoted in secondary literature. And I found it in the local public library in Detroit. And this little pamphlet had been produced like in 1934. And it was a pamphlet that had been produced by the attendance division of the school system because Allah Temple of Islam members were taking their children out of public school and putting them in the temple school. And so because of that, and because everybody in Detroit was on the dole getting welfare, right, the welfare agency went in and interviewed families, asking them, why are you taking your children out of school? And it's in those conversations that they talk about their lifestyle. So I found this document that I think it was 18 pages, and it detailed what today we would call the pioneers of the Nation of Islam, what they experienced in 1934 and what their lifestyle was. And I was like, well, I've only been in Detroit for 4 days and I found this. Why? And it's not like I'm like exceptional when it comes to digging. Do you know what I'm saying? I told you I found it at the public library. So then I felt like, oh my goodness, you know, what have the scholars been doing? And so that's when I became really committed to writing this book. 10 years later, it was done. It took a long time. You know, you do other things. But yeah, I continued to plow on the side. Oh, okay. Coming back to you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on the diet, or the recommended or popular diet of the times.
Yes, yes. During the diet was largely a vegetarian diet. It was largely a diet that was vegetarian, and it was encouraged that a person eat 1 meal a day, largely composed of a vegetarian diet. The teachings were that because people are constantly eating all day long, they're not giving their bodies time to digest what they actually eat. Also, being able to eat 1 meal a day, particularly during the Great Depression, right, when you really have little choice to do that, it kind of shifted the whole idea of a hunger pain being hunger as opposed to a pain that was an expression of discipline. But it was largely a vegetarian diet, absolutely no pork. They said you could have a cup of coffee and maybe a little bread roll in the morning, but largely 1 meal a day around 3 or 4 o'clock. That's what was encouraged. And the fact of the matter is, that diet is why many of those members just look so healthy. You just cannot, when you look at those pictures and the images, it's remarkable. They look incredibly healthy.
And would you be able to touch on the significance of the bean pie?
Ah, okay. There is a brother named, oh gosh, he wrote a whole paper on the bean pie. This is horrible. Jason Carter. He wrote a whole paper on the bean pie. And in it, basically, one of the things in terms of diet. So one of the things that Elijah Muhammad argued was that, you know, a lot of the diet that was a holdover from slavery was damaging to the body. So he basically said, you know, a lot of the larger beans, like the pinto bean, the larger beans are damaging to the body, so you should eat the smaller bean, like the navy bean. You shouldn't eat like, so what women did, they began to really experiment, largely, it's interesting, with beans and carrots, with a lot of beans and carrots, and eventually try to figure out, you know, different recipes. But when it came to all of these recipes, what was clear was that, like today, sugar is addictive. And the bakeries became phenomenal, not just because of the bread, but because of the healthy sweets. Now, how you go from selling the paper and the bean pie together, I can't tell you. But it eventually does happen. But your question is important, though, and I have to say, because in many ways it gets at one of the biggest myths about women in the Nation of Islam, and that is that they are not working outside the home. One of the biggest myths. That it's because of the work of women in the nation that this nation is able to sustain itself. Women are the ones that are baking those pies. Women are the ones that are working in those restaurants. Women are the ones that are working in the clothing factory. Women are the ones that are teachers at the schools. Women are the ones that are, you know, copy editing at Muhammad Speaks. So this whole idea that women are not working outside of the nation is one of the biggest myths, because their work is actually sustaining the nation.
Thank you.
I was kind of wondering if you could talk a little more on like the Black economy in relation to like farms and
Yes. So what we know is particularly, I think it was in the mid to late 60s, Elijah Muhammad and his organization, they began to buy up farmland in Georgia, which is where they were from. And yes, okay, exactly. Georgia and Michigan, exactly, that's true. That's true. Buying up farmland, and it becomes a way in which to try to create a sustainable economy. That is, the fruits and the vegetables that are grown on these farms are going to feed the restaurants and the grocery store. He really, really was pushing for a self-sustaining economy, and this is why many of the people who joined the Nation of Islam, particularly in the post-1965, some of them had trouble with the religious dictates, but none of them could deny the evidence of nation building. The fact that there are schools, the fact that there are restaurants, and that especially in Chicago, all of your needs could be met. So it's important to put it in that regards. But that economy was complicated in that, and the financial wealth that came from it, it didn't always trickle down to the rank and file members of the nation. So oftentimes that wealth was going up towards the royal family, and many people who were not ministers, who were not sister captains, who were not lieutenants, who were rank and file people, just found themselves really, really struggling. Well, because the farming isn't going to be happening in LA. So it's not like, it would be different if every mosque had their own kind of way of sustaining themselves, but that wasn't the case. So in the Midwest, or here, you had a better opportunity of being able to sustain yourself, as opposed to Los Angeles, as opposed to San Diego, as opposed to Oakland, places where that's not an option.
That great accumulation of wealth at the top, did people in the nation know that Muhammad's family was acquiring all of this wealth?
Yes.
And it was just, how was it viewed?
Well, one of the things that I gathered during this period is that people didn't gossip. People didn't gossip, so people might have critiqued it amongst themselves, but at least I was not able to find a literature or an archive where people are gossiping about it. Now, usually after one left the nation, and some of the memoirs, then they talked about it, right? Well, this is happening and this is happening. But while they were in it, at least I could not find a narrative where there were heavy critiques, even though people are very much aware of it. And people are struggling to meet the financial